This channel is part of the History Hit network.
On June the 14th, 1645, a moorland field in the English county of Northamptonshire was the setting for a defining moment in the destiny of a nation. For 2.5 years, the bloody civil war between the forces of Parliament and those of King Charles I had divided England. And it was on that early summer's day that the decisive battle of this bitter conflict was fought.
In the parliamentary camp, there was deep anxiety before the Battle of Naseby, because this was the new model army's first battle. If the new model army performed well, then there was a chance of actually bringing the war to a decisive conclusion sometime in 1646 or 1647. If there were to be a reverse, or even worse, a major defeat, then the parliamentary cause will be back in the situation that it had been in 1643 and 1644, effectively stalemated.
So there was a feeling that the war had to be ended soon, but nobody knew that it was going to be ended in the middle of a field halfway between Leicester and Northampton.
Here, we combine the latest computer animation techniques with 3D graphics to illustrate the ebb and flow of the battle and the key moments in the fighting. These techniques show that had the Royalist cavalry not been absent from the field at a crucial time, the outcome of the Battle of Naseby may have been very different indeed. The winter months of late 1644 and early 1645 were dismal and cold. But as the freezing snows finally melted, hopes on the Royalist side were high. Despite their calamitous defeat at Marston Moor the previous summer, there had been an upswing in the fortunes of the King's army. Victory at Lostwithiel and Crepee Bridge had come as some consolation for the loss of the north. On the parliamentary side, the failure to press home a numerical advantage at Newbury in the autumn of 1644 had posed uncomfortable questions about the composition of their army. In December 1644, Oliver Cromwell made a powerful address to the House of Commons, in which he argued that it was the divided nature of the parliamentary forces that had prevented victory so far. His message was that it was time to form a new, unified national army. Over the next few months, the new model army was born.
The failure of Parliament to take advantage of the tactical success at Marston Moor really clarified in Cromwell's mind the need for fundamental reforms in Parliament's military forces.
And he could see that the haphazard way that Parliament managed and funded its forces was useless.
It was almost like jobs for the boys. As long as there were a number of armies in the field, you needed a number of separate commanders. And Cromwell had become very suspicious of the motivations of the commanders. He actually felt a lot of these people were interested in actively prolonging the war because it gave them wealth and status and power.
The army needed to be essentially professionalised. The army needed to be brought under the command of officers who would hold no civil office, who would not be MPs, who would not have selfish interests at heart, but rather had as their primary interest the winning of the war.
So what Cromwell sought to do was to put an end to that situation, to force all the people who had commissions in the army and who were members of the House to resign their commissions.
Unless we remodel the army, Cromwell says, we cannot defeat the king.
On the 21st of January 1645, Sir Thomas Fairfax was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the new model army. At the time, Cromwell held no formal position within it, but Parliament insisted he take command of Fairfax's cavalry, a position that was his by the time of the Battle of Naseby on June the 14th.
History Hit is like Netflix just for history fans, with exclusive history documentaries covering some of the most famous people and events in history, just for you. Whether you're looking to dive into life and crime in Victorian London, or the forgotten history that deserves to be heard, History Hit has a documentary for you, just a click away. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you can't find anywhere else. Sign up now for a free trial, and Absolute History fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code AbsoluteHistory at checkout.
The fact was, however, that in the spring of 1645, no one could be sure when the two sides would next meet on the field. In April, both armies were stationed in the south of England, Fairfax's new model army at Windsor and the King's forces at Oxford. Decisions had to be made about strategy and tactics as the campaigning season got underway, and it was on the 8th of May at Stow-on-the-Wold that the King called a council of war with his nephew, Prince Rupert, and the commander of his forces in the southwest, Lord George Goring. During the meeting, Charles was presented with different options by his senior commanders.
Digby and Goring were for an immediate attack on the new model army. They regarded it as a contemptible rabble. One battle and they would smash it completely.
It's not hard to see Goring's reasoning, for at that time, the new model army was a poorly supplied force. By May 1645, for example, many units had still to receive their famous red uniforms. Goring was convinced that the army could be crushed in the south while it was still in its infancy.
Rupert was more circumspect. Rupert had actually fought the parliamentarians at Marston Moor, and Rupert had come off second best at Marston Moor. He had more respect for them. And so Rupert advocated going north.
One of the king's few strongholds in the region was the city of Chester, which was then under siege by the parliamentarians. Rupert reasoned that if the siege could be lifted, it would open the way for the royalists to advance further north, where they'd be able to link up with the Earl of Montrose, whose small force in Scotland had secured a number of successes.
Montrose had enjoyed a series of spectacular victories in the propaganda sense, but in real military terms they were very slight. Montrose's army was tiny and it tended to melt away after they had a victory anyway. But it seems that Charles had at the back of his mind a possible link up with Montrose.
A lot of the king's other advisors don't want him to do that. And there is a fight. Do we go north, or do we stay in the Midlands, or do we go south and west? And the royalists dither. And in the end, the king tries to have it both ways.
Rupert and Goring were not great friends, and to avoid conflict and argument, the king eventually decided on a messy compromise between the two proposals.
Either of the courses of action that were open to them were good courses of action potentially. However, King Charles decided, rather than to keep his forces concentrated in order to do one of the two things that he had the option of doing, decided to split his forces.
One of the main consequences of the Council of War is that Goring is allowed to effectively split the Royalist field army. He takes something like 3,000 cavalry and 1,500 infantry and moves down to the West Country where he can exercise his own independent command.
In the days after the Stowe Council of War, Lord Goring set off for the West Country as the main Royalist army of 12,000 troops marched towards Chester. The new model army, too, was on the move, towards the West Country. But when Fairfax's troops reached Blandford, they also split in two, with a small force detached to deal with the threat of Goring in the west, but with the main force sent northeast to besiege the Royalist stronghold at Oxford. When the king reached Market Drayton on the 22nd of May, he was forced to reappraise his position. The siege at Chester had been lifted, and it was his capital at Oxford that was now under threat. In response, Prince Rupert proposed a full-scale assault against a town held by Parliament that would draw the enemy away from Oxford. So it was that the Royalist army abandoned its march north and headed east to besiege the town of Leicester.
By attacking and seizing Leicester, King Charles hoped to do two things. First, he hoped to join together two Royalist enclaves in the East Central Midlands, and thus put a thorn, if you like, right in the centre of an important recruiting and provisioning area for the parliamentarian cause. But perhaps at least as important was his aim of drawing away the new model army from Oxford. So by attacking a city that mattered an awful lot to the parliamentarians, he hoped to be able to draw the new model army north, engage it battle, and perhaps turn the tide of the English Civil War.
By attacking Leicester, King Charles takes the initiative. He forces Parliament to react to him, rather than just reacting to the parliamentary siege of Oxford. King Charles takes control of the war for a brief period.
Charles actually believed that the storming of Leicester would be a very easy business. In fact, it wasn't. It was an exceedingly bloody battle. The Royalists suffered very, very heavy casualties indeed, and parliamentary forces resisted with enormous vigour. They actually had to fight their way street by street, almost house by house, through to the centre of the town. And there in the centre, the parliamentary garrison finally laid down its arms. Now, Royalist blood was up. They were very, very angry. They'd suffered heavy casualties. And so murder began.
The Royalist capture of parliamentary Leicester provoked a heated debate on the parliamentary side. The spilt blood at Leicester encouraged those who favoured a settlement with the king, while the war faction demanded revenge. It was the stronger hearts who won the argument. On the 5th of June, the new model army abandoned its siege at Oxford and headed north towards Leicester, at the same time as the Royalists marched south. The two armies were now on a collision course. On the 13th of June, at an inn in a small Northamptonshire village, came the prelude to one of English history's most important battles. It was a rearguard of King Charles's forces who encountered the advance units of the new model army at the village inn in Naseby. On the evening of June the 13th, 20 Royalist troops who'd been left to look out for the enemy were taken prisoner by parliamentary soldiers commanded by Henry Ayrton. The news came as a shock to the king, who had been unaware of the close proximity of Fairfax's army and who now faced a critical decision.
When Charles heard of the immediate proximity of the new model army to his own, he was faced with options. He could either retreat, probably to the city of Leicester, seek safety within its walls and await the arrival of reinforcements, but of course it also meant a retreat to that city, which was still a dozen or so miles distant, and during that process there was a reasonable chance that his army might be attacked on the line of march, ill-formed for battle, and perhaps even cut to pieces or put to rout. Alternatively, he could engage in battle. And certainly when it came to this decision, he was strongly influenced not by Prince Rupert, who favoured the retreat towards Leicester, but by others of his advisers, in particular by Lord Digby and by Jack Ashburnham. Both of these men argued that the morale of their own army was extremely high, having just taken Leicester, that their soldiers, if you like, were up for a fight, but that the morale of the new model army was low.
An emergency council of war was convened at Harborough, and Charles was persuaded to stand and fight.
Essentially, Naseby is a meeting engagement. It's like Gettysburg, where the two sides almost blunder into each other. In this instance, they are looking to fight, but it doesn't happen because one side's in a pre-arranged position. They are actually both travelling the country and collide together in Northamptonshire.
At 2 o'clock in the morning on June the 14th, 1645, the men of the Royalist army were woken from their sleep with the dramatic news that they were to go into a full-pitched battle that very day, and as the summer dawn broke, the two armies began to form into their positions, which were some 4 miles apart.
The decision to fight at Naseby was essentially the product of Prince Rupert's own personal reconnaissance. Going forward in front of his own army, he perceived what he thought was a retreat by cavalry of the New Model Army, and believing that the New Model Army was either not ready for battle or was trying to retreat away from a battle, he decided to strike immediately with all the forces at his disposal. This is why the battle took place where it did, when it did, and in the manner which it did.
Although the two forces could clearly see each other, Fairfax and Cromwell made the wise decision to have a closer look at the battlefield. Cromwell felt that the New Model Army's position, which lay behind a marshy valley, was unsuitable. So Fairfax ordered a withdrawal to a new position behind a ridge on Mill Hill. The undulating nature of the land here meant that the parliamentary force was no longer visible to their enemy. Prince Rupert, concerned by the parliamentary troop movements, ordered a scout to ride off and investigate. But when he returned, the scout claimed to have seen nothing. Rupert therefore set off to see for himself, only to find what looked like a retreating parliamentary army. The prince was delighted. Now was the time to finish off the rebels once and for all. But, as we've seen, the New Model Army was not retreating. It was simply reforming in a stronger, more favourable position. By the time the Royalists themselves moved forward to a position on Dust Hill, their enemy was ready and prepared for battle. There was another vital factor that gradually became clear to the Royalists as the morning unfolded. The cavalry of Lord George Goring was not going to be present on the day. The King had summoned his southwest commander from the West Country to join up with the main Royalist force, but Goring had sent a letter back saying that he was unable to make the journey. But the letter never arrived. Instead, it was intercepted by his enemies, leaving Fairfax and Cromwell in no doubt that it was they who possessed the numerically superior army.
Goring is a courtier, and he has his own standing in the Royalist army. And when he goes off to the southwest, he is the big fish in the little pond. He's independent. He's the big man. He can do what he likes. And when he gets an order to rejoin, he finds that he can't.
There remains to this day the strong suspicion that Goring may have stayed away as a result of his own ambition. He preferred to be an independent commander. We know he was already at loggerheads with Prince Rupert, and there is a strong suspicion that says he decided to keep himself in the West Country.
To this day, the difference that Goring's 3,000 men would have made to the Royalist cause remains a matter of debate.
First, If Goering's forces had been present, the Royalist and the parliamentary armies would have been approximately equal in number. And second, and far more importantly, if Goering's cavalry had been present, there was some chance that a decent reconnaissance would have actually been carried out, and the Royalists would have actually discovered the exact strength and exact locations of the parliamentary army.
Even contemporary chroniclers were unsure of the precise numbers of men who took to the battlefield of Naseby. Some suggested that the king may have mustered as few as 7,500 men against a new model army of around 14,000. But a more likely figure for the royalist numbers is 12,000 troops. Whatever the exact numbers, it is certain that the royalist army was outnumbered, particularly among the ranks of the cavalry. This remarkably detailed drawing of the dispositions at Naseby was published 2 years later in a book entitled Anglia Rediviva, and the illustration reveals clearly that the two armies were arranged in the typical manner of the day. Both sides deployed their infantry in the centre, with the cavalry on the flanks.
If your cavalry are out on your flanks, it gives them freedom of movement. If your cavalry are on your flanks, they've got freedom of action. The infantry deploy with infantry guns and with their own muskets. They want a clear field of fire forward towards the enemy.
Fire!
If the cavalry get in the way, you've got to stop firing or you'll hit your own cavalry. So if you keep your cavalry on the flanks, you can send them wherever you like without getting in the way of the infantry and the field guns.
In addition, the presence of a solid block of infantry in the centre of the battlefield provided a stable centre around which the battle could, if you like, hinge or rotate. However, if the cavalry were in the centre and charged and the position became rather loose, then what you would have essentially was an army that was split in two with a gap in the middle. So infantry in the centre for stability, cavalry on the flanks for exploitation and for deciding the battle.
We have to remember that the armies of the Civil War had a common training. They both had their roots in the train band system and in officers who'd fought with the Swedish army on the continent. So the tactics employed by both sides came from a common root. For that reason, they both fought in exactly the same way.
Shortly after 10 o'clock on June the 14th, King Charles's army began a general advance towards the broad moor that separated Dust Hill from Mill Hill. On their left flank was the cavalry of Sir Marmaduke Langdale. On the right were mounted troops led by Prince Rupert himself, all armed with the 3-foot broadsword that was the typical cavalryman's weapon of the day. In the centre, Lord Astley took command of the main body of infantry, the foot soldiers who were formed closely together and armed with two very different weapons. The pike and the musket played their full part on the battlefield of Naseby.
You needed to protect your muskets against horse. Now, a pike is excellent protection against horse. A horse will not charge a line of pikemen. So the idea was you combine your infantry and you have pike for protection from horse and musket for offensive action. You've got defense and you've got offense. It wasn't until very late in the 17th century that the bayonet was invented, and the bayonet would give you the ability both to defend against horse and to attack with your musket.
The contemporary drawing of the dispositions at Naseby reveals that pikemen and musketeers made up the infantry forces of both sides. It also shows clearly that the two forces arranged their infantry units in a similar pattern. This was the so-called Swedish pattern.
The Swedish pattern of infantry deployment was devised and introduced into European warfare by Gustavus Adolphus in the 1630s. Basically, this was designed to maximize infantry firepower. What Gustavus did was organize his musketeers into 6 ranks. And he'd actually worked out that he could have the front rank engaged in continual firing while the other 5 ranks were in the various phases of reloading. And so the idea was that as the rear rank had completely reloaded, they would rush forward and occupy the position the front rank had occupied, because the front rank would just have fired. And the idea was that you could then advance slowly with the rear rank running forward. And it was rather like an infantry rolling barrage.
This Swedish pattern was an arrangement with the appearance of a chessboard. It was within the chessboard that the army's artillery was positioned.
In the Civil War period, the guns were deployed on the field, but they came in a bewildering array of calibers, from a tiny thing that fired musket balls not much larger than a golf ball through to a 12-pound ball, which would actually be very devastating if it hit anybody, but the instances were fairly few. And at the end of the day, the weapons were very, very inaccurate. So they tended to, in one of the phrases, they tended to frighten more than they harmed. They had a good morale effect. They look great. They give people a sense of safety if they're on your own side, and they look very menacing from the opposition. But in practice, I don't think they were lethal weapons on the battlefield.
On the morning of June the 14th, the battle began when the Swedish formation of Royalist infantry began their move forward towards the lines of the new model army foot. Astley's men were supported to their rear by reserve units consisting of 2 regiments of horse, the King's Own Life Guards and Prince Rupert's regiment of foot. Prince Rupert, however, chose to lead from the front, with his own Life Guard leading his cavalry into the left flank of the parliamentary line, a force of mounted men under the command of Henry Ireton. In the hours that followed, the command of the King's nephew became one of the most important factors in the outcome of the battle. As a cavalry commander, Prince Rupert was familiar with the kind of mounted warfare that characterized the age. At the Battle of Edgehill in 1642, he led a cavalry charge right through the parliamentary line. But the charge continued well away from the main centre of the fighting, and, on that occasion, the prince's return to the fray came just in time to save the day for the Royalist army. Clearly, no lessons had been learned from the close call at Edgehill 3 years earlier. The prince remained committed to a full cavalry charge, despite the almost impossible task of maintaining order and discipline among his own troops.
I'm sure what Rupert was thinking was, all I've got to do is put one decent charge in against these people, and they will scatter. And if I can do that, if I can actually shock them into retreat, then I will win this action. I will destroy their new model army, and we will have a position of considerable advantage. And so really, the cavalry charge is a way in which Rupert can actually win this battle, even though the Royalist army is outnumbered.
The term cavalier has come into our own language as somebody who's dashing and slightly unreliable, and this was certainly the case with Rupert. He would lead a cavalry charge at a ferocious gallop, but he saw it as his job to disperse the enemy, to chase them off the field and to make sure they couldn't come back and threaten his own infantry. Of course, in doing so, it means that he personally leaves the field and has no ability to affect the outcome of the battle.
A striking contrast emerged between the tactics of Prince Rupert and his counterpart on the right flank of the new model army. Here, Oliver Cromwell took charge of his mounted units, waiting to engage his opposite number, Langdale. Cromwell had already proved himself a more innovative commander when it came to the business of maintaining control over units of cavalry.
Cromwell was an extremely competent cavalry commander, and he could do things with cavalry that most other mid-17th century commanders could only dream about. He, for example, could actually bring cavalry back from a charge and reform and charge again. How did he do this? It was through training. It was through establishing standard operating procedures. Now, this is something that Rupert didn't do.
There was no doubt that in the full heat of battle, the more disciplined force of cavalry was far more likely to prevail.
Would I rather have Prince Rupert as my cavalry commander, who would charge only once a day and then be off butchering the baggage train and breaking open casks of wine? Or would I rather have Oliver Cromwell as my cavalry commander, who will charge and then charge again, perhaps not attacking the enemy's logistics? I would rather have Oliver Cromwell as my cavalry commander.
As Oliver Cromwell prepared to engage his cavalry, Thomas Fairfax watched as the infantry deployed in the centre under Sir Philip Skippon. Here, Fairfax's advantage in numbers enabled him to keep his own regiment in an overlapping reserve, to be held back until required. This was not his only advantage. Unlike the king, Fairfax was also able to deploy a force of dragoons, expert horsemen who dismounted to engage the enemy with musket fire. Fairfax chose to position his dragoons behind a row of hedges, and they were amongst the first into the action as the Battle of Naseby was joined. As Prince Rupert led a dashing cavalry charge from wide on his flank towards the men of Henry Ireton, the dragoons of Colonel Oakey fired their weapons. Their musket fire failed to stop the prince's advance, and it was only when the two forces of cavalry thundered together that Rupert was forced to come to a temporary halt. The brief halt to Rupert's progress gave Ireton the chance to engage the cavalry regiment of Rupert's brother, Prince Maurice, which was closer to the centre of the line. Meanwhile, the two forces of infantry had joined in combat. Lord Astley's men were quick to push their enemy back as Rupert prepared to return to the fray. When he did, the results were dramatic. While Oakey's dragoons kept up their musket fire, the king's nephew swept forward against the west of the parliamentary line, as Ireton sought to give cavalry support to the infantry struggling on his right. As Skippon's infantry toiled in the centre, on the right, Cromwell once again proved his talent on the battlefield. With the advantage of a downhill slope, his cavalry forced Langdale's men back behind the line of the infantry reserve. As the noise of over 20,000 men-at-arms filled the air, Cromwell was able to maintain his cavalry regiments in strict order as the parliamentarians took charge of the right. But, on the other flank, Prince Rupert succeeded in smashing through the mounted units of Henry Ireton. Cavalry successes were now even, but it was at this crucial stage of the battle that Prince Rupert made the serious tactical error that proved so costly to the Royalist cause. Having made his breakthrough, Rupert simply kept on going, as far as the parliamentary baggage train near Naseby village itself. It was a common practice for a cavalry charge to lead to the pursuit of booty from the baggage train. After all, Rupert had done exactly the same at Edgehill. But at Edgehill, he had returned in time to influence the later stages of the battle. At Naseby, the story was very different.
Prince Rupert has had a very bad press for the last 350 years. He was undoubtedly very brave, but he's always portrayed as headstrong and indeed sometimes stupid. Why does he always go for the enemy baggage train after he's driven the enemy horse from the field? Well, he's always going for the enemy baggage train because this is the operational, indeed sometimes the strategic objective. If you take that baggage train, you effectively cut the logistics of the enemy army.
At the moment that Prince Rupert led his cavalry south away from the battlefield of Naseby in pursuit of at least a large portion of Ireton's cavalry, the battle was going extremely well for the Royalists. And therefore he could be forgiven perhaps at that moment for believing that the battle was almost won, and that his job was to pursue the enemy's cavalry from the battlefield, either to prevent it rallying and counter-attacking and perhaps turning the tide again, or perhaps more likely, rallying in order to cover the retreat of the New Model Army's infantry. Arguably his mistake, however, was in not dealing with what of Ireton's cavalry remained on the battlefield. It's popularly imagined that most of Ireton's cavalry broke and fled. In actual fact, probably less than half of Ireton's cavalry was actually driven from the battlefield. Rupert needed to leave at least some troops behind, or organise the deployment of the King's Reserve, in order to deal with these cavalry, because they were able to rally, re-inject themselves into the battle, and in fact play a decisive role in the destruction of King Charles's army.
Rupert's departure left his uncle's infantry cruelly exposed, and, to add insult to injury, the company of parliamentarian musketeers positioned around the baggage train beat off Rupert's attacks. By the time he realized his mistake, the course of the battle had changed for good. With Rupert's cavalry absent, the outnumbered Royalist army in the field north of Naseby found itself in deep trouble. Colonel Oakey now ordered his dragoons to mount and engage the left flank of the Royalist infantry. These foot soldiers were already suffering on the right, as Cromwell again revealed his masterly control of cavalry in battle. With an uncanny understanding of the overall course of the fighting, he split his force in two, ordering one detachment to prevent the reformation of Langdale's horse, and the other to sweep into the suffering ranks of Royalist foot.
We can't really stress enough just how important Cromwell's ability is in terms of both managing his cavalry, but also having superiority in numbers. It's very, very crucial at Naseby because once Cromwell's broken the northern horse under Langdale, he's able to send some of his men to pursue Langdale's and use the rest of his men to attack the Royalist infantry. Now he can only do that because of his superiority in numbers. Had Goring come back from the West Country, the forces would have been much more balanced. But as it was a combination of two things really that swing the day: Cromwell's discipline and his superior numbers.
With Rupert still nowhere to be seen, Thomas Fairfax decided it was time to deploy his own overlapping infantry regiment. The Royalist foot soldiers were now alone and surrounded, and the battle was all but over. As Prince Rupert finally returned in a huge, sweeping movement to the back of his depleted front, his uncle, the king, made a last desperate attempt to continue the fight by deploying his final reserves in the centre. Showing great personal courage, Charles himself prepared to lead his troops into battle. But it was not to be. As Charles set off to engage the enemy, the Earl of Carnroth grabbed the bridle of the king's horse and pleaded with him not to go to your death upon an instant. It would probably have made little difference had Charles not been dissuaded from a self-sacrificial attack. Cromwell still had enough fresh, spare men to face them. Although Rupert was now back among the ranks, the day was lost, and the remains of the king's proud army were put to flight in the direction of Leicester. The Battle of Naseby was over, and the new model army had won its first famous victory. But this was not quite the end of the bloodshed. As part of the spoils of war, the parliamentarians ransacked the king's own baggage train. It was here, away from the fighting, that the camp followers and wives of the royalist soldiers were waiting. But there were also women with no formal relationship with the royalist troops, for, as was common practice at the time, Charles's army was accompanied by a party of prostitutes. For the victorious Puritan parliamentarians, this evidence of immorality among the royalist enemy triggered a terrifying postscript to the day's battle.
Essentially, the parliamentary cavalry overran the royalist encampment and the royalist baggage train. And there they found a number of Welsh women and Irish women. These were the wives of some of the soldiers, some were camp followers. And they rode these women down. And at least 100, that's a very conservative estimate, were literally cut down. And the cavalry soldiers of the new model army were screaming at them as they rode down these women, "Death to the Catholic horse." Those they didn't kill, they cut about the face to disfigure them. So we're talking about people who took their religion very, very seriously and took it to the point of barbarity and indeed beyond the point of barbarity.
For the motley collection of women who accompanied Charles's army, death and mutilation were the consequences of the royalist defeat at Naseby, a fate shared by many on the battlefield. Upwards of 1,000 royalist troops lost their lives. By contrast, estimates suggest that only 200 of their opponents were killed. No one will ever know exactly how many prisoners were taken during and after the battle. Many royalist cavalrymen did succeed in making an escape, including the king and his nephew. But the infantry were not so lucky. It is thought 5,000 men were captured in total, along with vast quantities of guns, ammunition, and artillery pieces. There was one final disaster for the king. His own private correspondence, revealing his secret negotiations with potential supporters in Ireland and France, was seized by parliamentary soldiers. Within days, crowds in London learned with trepidation that their king was prepared to do deals with Catholics in pursuit of his cause. There can be no doubt that June the 14th, 1645, marked the beginning of the end for King Charles I.
Naseby represented a signal point. It represented the point at which the cause of King Charles was confirmed as lost. It represented the point at which, essentially, Parliament, should it decide to do so, could lay down terms to the king. The Battle of Naseby did not see the forces of King Charles I destroyed. It did see them essentially crippled. The old royalist infantry had gone, the cavalry had been humiliated, and it's worth bearing in mind just how much contempt the royalists had felt towards the new model army before the Battle of Naseby. This was an army they were going to defeat, not an army that was going to destroy them. And so the crippling blow to their morale is something which is worthy of remark.
The loss of the Battle of Naseby was of great significance for the king. It meant the end of his last army in the field, and that was a very, very important thing for Charles, because his only chance of winning the Civil War was to do battle in the field. Once he'd lost his army, he was able to hang on for another year in a series of sieges, but by then, really, the main chance had gone.
In the month that followed Naseby, King Charles drifted aimlessly from place to place in search of the military support that would take the fight to the new model army once more. It never came, and within the year, the king surrendered to the Scots, another step on the road that would eventually lead to his execution in January 1649.
Naseby is the beginning of modern military administration in Great Britain. And Parliament wins this war not because of their ideological superiority, not because necessarily God is on their side, but because they know how to run an army.
The Battle of Naseby became synonymous with that moment when middle class and lower middle class Englishmen had organized themselves into an efficient army. And they'd actually taken on the forces of the Ancien regime, the forces of the English aristocracy, and they had defeated them.
Naseby was crucial. In a very real sense, it guaranteed the survival of British parliamentary democracy.